The fight against government use of facial recognition technology is an important one being fought by civil liberties and other activist groups. Unfortunately, the technology is already out there, in use, and endangering people's privacy. In our next talk, speakers with the Electronic Frontier Foundation will explain issues with facial recognition tech, where we stand legally in relation to its use, and their new interactive site, which can reveal what agencies have been using your image. We present Dr. Matthew Guariglia and Jason Kelley with Who Has Your Face? The fight against U.S. government agencies' use of face recognition.
Who are you? Who are you?
Hey, this is a restricted area. He's in.
Hi, I'm Jason Kelley, the Associate Director of Research at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And I'm going to talk today, along with my colleague Matthew Guariglia, about the dangers of face recognition, especially in the hands of government and law enforcement. The reason the talk is called Who Has Your Face is I want you to think about that question as you watch the presentation, and hopefully at the end, you'll have some answers around who in fact does have your image for facial recognition purposes. Now, we just saw a clip from the 1987 movie RoboCop that is a little far-fetched in many ways, but actually demonstrates some of the dangers of police use of face recognition. You saw that Murphy couldn't identify an assailant, and he went to the police station to try to use the face recognition tool to determine the identity of the person that he earlier had killed. And he was able to do that despite the fact that he didn't technically have access to that tool by pressuring people with a giant spike in this case. But that's actually exactly the kind of problems that real life face recognition technology use by law enforcement has. In many cases, there are police who can have access to the tool for one purpose or shouldn't have access to the tool in general and use it for a different purpose or find a way to access it for illegitimate purposes. For those of you who don't know, EFF is a member-supported civil liberties organization. We work to ensure that when you go online and when you're in digital spaces, your use of technology is protected and your rights are protected as well. So actually, this year we're celebrating our 30th anniversary. EFF was founded by its co-founders in 1990 and is 30 years old this year. It was 30 years old actually just this month. It was built before the World Wide Web, in fact. So I don't know if you are familiar with EFF, but we've done some really fun things for our 30th anniversary, including a 7-hour live stream that aired a few weeks ago on our actual anniversary with DJs and a bunch of other cool stuff. I hope you can check that out if you weren't able to watch it when it aired. It's available at the Internet Archive and on social media platforms. If you'd like to learn more about what EFF does, you can go to eff.org/30. The fights against misuse of technology, the fights to protect your privacy, the fight back against surveillance have not slowed down in those 30 years. So EFF's work is more important than ever, and we appreciate if you're able to take a look at what we work on and potentially consider becoming a member if you're not already. So I want to start by positioning EFF's fight against facial recognition technology and its misuse by government and law enforcement within the broader work that EFF does, which you can categorize in basically 3 ways: impact litigation, technology projects, and activism. A few examples of some of the issues the EFF has worked on over the years. In our impact litigation and legal work, we've sued the NSA over mass spying, as well as AT&T. We've sued the Department of Homeland Security for illegally searching devices at the border. And we also have a coders' rights team that you may have heard of that helps defend programmers and developers who are doing security research. Then with our technology projects or tech projects team, we build privacy protective software. So you might be familiar with the difference between an HTTP website and an HTTPS website. In fact, you're probably more familiar than I am. The team at Let's Encrypt and CertBot helps people install those SSL certificates. I hope I'm getting that right. To ensure that websites are secure and encrypted. The Privacy Badger team builds a tool called Privacy Badger that protects you from third-party trackers, cookies that follow you around the web to make sure your experience of the web is more private. Then we have an activism team. That's the team that I'm on and the team that Matthew's on. We focus on digital campaigns around legislation and also just around broad education. So you might have noticed a few months ago, the .org domain was potentially going to be taken over by a private equity firm. And the activism team, along with legal and tech, worked on that. We also do education on the activism team. What that means is essentially that we build websites, we build tools that help educate people around technology and its use. One of the tools or educational tools that we've created is called street level surveillance. So street level surveillance is essentially an educational website that tells people about the sorts of surveillance that is out there being used by law enforcement. An example, face recognition, but additional examples might be body worn cameras, cell site simulators, social media surveillance, and drones. So why does this matter? Why does the EFF fight back against unrestrained surveillance? To put it bluntly, surveillance like this makes it harder for us to live our lives. If you know that you're being watched by police because they're using automated license plate readers to follow your car wherever it goes, are you more likely or less likely to do things? Even if those things aren't dangerous, just knowing that you're being surveilled can chill your ability to freely associate and express yourself. This also can potentially infringe on your First Amendment rights. For example, after the Freddie Gray murder in Baltimore a few years ago, police used social media surveillance to determine who had been at the protests and arrest those individuals. Now, if you have a restriction or feel a restriction on posting things on social media because police are going to surveil that, you're less likely to use it and post those things. These different pieces of surveillance all come together to create a kind of broad, dangerous surveillance network by both government and law enforcement that overall can make it less likely for you to live the life that you would like to live. With EFF's work on digital rights, we tend to focus on the surveillance tools themselves, but the way these tools work can restrict everything that you do, from online work to offline work. So how is EFF fighting back against misuse of facial recognition technology within the context of these three areas? Primarily through activism. We know that right now there's time to ban facial recognition technology's use by government and law enforcement, but people need to know how it's used, what it does, and that they can actually ban this tool. So usually EFF's work involves a lot of blogs, a lot of white papers, and a lot of testimony, basically a lot of text. But what we've worked on over the last few years is expanding into a little bit more interactive tools that can give people a better, clearer sense of how surveillance affects them. Even though we'd like to say, this is what, and we do say, this is what a surveillance camera looks like, the better option would be for us to walk to a city with people and give them a tour and say, that's a surveillance camera and here's how it works, so that you know where surveillance cameras exist within your own community. We're working on that. So to start, in 2018, EFF launched Spot the Surveillance, which is a VR experience that teaches people to recognize how to identify spying technologies that police might use in their own communities. Now, it's not specific to any area, it's just a single location, but the idea is to educate people on how surveillance works and what it looks like. Just this month, we launched the Atlas of Surveillance. The Atlas is a map that, as well as a searchable database that lets you zoom around the US, looking at what police departments use which surveillance tech, from drones to cell site simulators to body-worn cameras to facial recognition technology. You can see in this version of the map that I'm selecting which Bay Area police departments use facial recognition technology, and then I'm zooming out to show you that there are 360 overall across the United States. That's just the beginning. That's certainly not all of them. You'll notice a cluster in Washington, D.C., as well as in Florida. Now in D.C., that's because there are a lot of federal agencies that have used facial recognition technology. And in Florida, there's been a push for a long time now to use facial recognition. And Florida actually has the oldest facial recognition database in the country. The Atlas was put together using publicly available records, like budgetary records and news stories about law enforcement surveillance tech. So if there was a budget listing, a budget item from the police department about a facial recognition tool, it might be in the Atlas. Or if there was a news story about someone being captured or apprehended or identified using facial recognition, that might also be in the Atlas. But there are thousands and thousands of departments we simply don't have the research for yet, because the Atlas was just launched and it will never be comprehensive. And additionally, most states and cities don't actually require police to have a public hearing about the surveillance tech that they buy. It might never become clear what they have access to. So we have the Spot the Surveillance tool, we have the Atlas of Surveillance tool. In the case of face recognition, what we'd really like is to build a customized list telling you who has your face. That's what we tried to build with the Who Has Your Face tool. By answering a few questions, you can determine which agencies likely have access to your facial recognition photo. I'll get into that in a bit. So how does law enforcement hide its use of surveillance tech? Basically, I showed you what Atlas can tell us, but there are lots of departments that we don't know use facial recognition technology. Here's how they do it. They use private companies like Amazon or Clearview to give them access to the tool that they wouldn't otherwise use. So let's go through a few examples of the kinds of facial recognition tools that police often use. We'll start with Clearview AI. And Clearview was a tool that came to light in January. In January, no one really knew what it meant when a law enforcement department listed that they had a contract with Clearview. Now we know that Clearview AI is a facial recognition company that scraped 3 billion images from the web, from places like Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Venmo. And this company claims that it has more than 1,000 law enforcement officers or agencies that have contracts with it. This includes the Justice Department, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, and even organizations like the New Jersey Attorney General's office were surprised to learn that police departments within New Jersey were not only using the tool when this New York Times story broke about it, but they were using an image of the Attorney General to sell their services to other agencies. Until just a month ago, Amazon's recognition software was a cheap and easily available facial recognition tool for law enforcement. You can see in this table that if you're familiar with the AWS, Amazon Web Services payment structure, Amazon's recognition makes it easy for people to pay a small amount of money to submit thousands and thousands of images, one at a time or in bulk, to recognition. Now, just this month, some companies have started to at least publicly recognize the danger this technology poses when it's used by government and law enforcement. Amazon has paused its law enforcement use of the software until 2021. Their claim is that by then, there will be safeguards or regulations in place. IBM, meanwhile, has completely sworn off making the software. There will always be some company willing to make and sell law enforcement this sort of technology. The bottom line is that we need to ban its use by government agencies. Perhaps a bigger problem than these private companies selling law enforcement agencies access to facial recognition technology and software is the use of government databases that already exist for facial recognition technology. You might have seen a report that Georgetown University's Center on Privacy and Technology put out about a year ago called Perpetual Lineup. And one of the important points that report and website make is that over half of Americans are already in facial recognition databases accessible by police. That's because over the years, government agencies like DMVs across the country, as well as federal agencies like the Department of State, have implemented facial recognition technology on the databases that they already have holding images for your photo IDs. So you'll see in this picture, a passport, a driver's license, and a visa. These databases all have facial recognition technology, and some of that technology, like with state DMVs, was initially used to defend against fraud, so that when you go to the DMV and you take a picture, the DMV knows that there's already a license submitted or given to a person that looks just like you. But over the years, these state DMVs and federal agencies have started expanding the use of facial recognition technology beyond those fraud protective purposes. Most federal agencies have been sneakily signing memorandums of understanding with their DMVs, allowing them to request access to the DMV facial recognition databases that hold millions of headshots from government IDs. To give you a quick understanding of how facial recognition technology is accessed through DMVs by law enforcement and other government agencies, I'm going to play a quick video from Claire Garvey in the New York Times. Claire Garvey is a privacy expert and a facial recognition technology researcher at Georgetown. And this video appeared just a few months ago. You might know Claire from her work on Perpetual Lineup.
We're all getting comfortable with face recognition, unlocking our phones, skipping airport lines, and even unlocking front doors. But the convenience is blinding us to how risky this technology actually is and how it is being used without us realizing. I'm Claire Garvey. My job is to research the use of face recognition technology by law enforcement and then make recommendations around the use of the technology. Right now, most Americans are in a perpetual police lineup because they got a driver's license. After that DMV agent snaps your picture, your face is turned into a face print, a unique series of numbers that a face recognition system can read and compare to other faces. Now, any police officer can run searches against your face for any reason. Who robbed that corner store? Who was jaywalking at 3 a.m.? Who was at this protest? The digital equivalent of police walking through a crowd and yanking each of our IDs out of our pockets. You could be picked out, investigated, possibly arrested, and sent to jail because you got a driver's license in one of these 32 states. That's a violation of your privacy and your Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable search. And that's just the tip of the iceberg.
Having government-issued identification is basically a necessity at this point. Through those DMVs, law enforcement and government agencies have access to more than 641 million photos now for facial recognition purposes. Photos of more than half of Americans. The total number of DMVs you'll see listed here on the screen with facial recognition is at least 43, with only 4 of those limiting data sharing entirely. That means that 39 DMVs share access to some of their data with other law enforcement and state or federal agencies. Now, this is an ongoing battle. Just this month, Missouri, which had banned facial recognition use by the DMV, passed a bill to implement it during a closed session within a huge omnibus package containing a lot of other bills. There was no room for citizens to comment, and the bill passed within a short period of time. These are battles that are ongoing. There is time to fight back. In our research for the Who Has Your Face project released a few months ago, we counted at least 27 states you can see on the screen where the FBI can search or request data from driver's license and ID databases. In June of last year, the Government Accountability Office reported only 21. That means 6 new states began offering data from their facial recognition databases to the FBI in the last year. This is an ongoing and changing battleground. Here are the DMVs that definitely have agreements to share FR database access in some way with local or state law enforcement. This means that even if agencies in these states are, for example, barred from using Clearview or Recognition, often they can simply send a photo, a mugshot, a photo taken from a mobile device, a photo pulled from social media, directly to the DMV, who can run the images through their database. This isn't a comprehensive list, though. It's nearly impossible to know which agencies are sharing these photos and with whom. Each agency across the US, from state DMVs to the State Department, share access to their photos differently depending on agreements with local police, other states, and federal agencies. For the Who Has Your Face project, we submitted dozens of public records requests, but we were lucky enough to also use the data that Georgetown had found through its public records requests for its perpetual lineup project. Unfortunately, even with submitting public records requests, it can take years to compile the results, and you may not even get them. We were continuously thwarted in our research by non-responsive government agencies, by conflicting information between agencies, agreements that had been superseded by new agreements, and the generally covert and frankly opaque nature of these policies. This is a huge problem. It should be easy to learn who has your image for facial recognition purposes, but in fact, it's not. Some DMVs give the public the precise number of requests that they've been made for facial recognition. As an example here with Wisconsin, it received 238 requests in 2016. And there's a table on the screen of what kinds of crimes the requests were that were submitted. You'll see a cybercrime column here with 13 total cases, 13 photos submitted and 4 matched. Now, where did they get the photos for cybercrime to submit to Wisconsin's DMV database? Who knows? Another thing that you might see when you do a public records request for this kind of data is who made the requests and how many they made. A list of agency requests to Utah's DMV included Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, the Department of Homeland Security, various state fusion centers, state secret service agencies, and the United States Office of National Drug Control Policy. This list is 62 pages long. It starts in 2015 and goes to 2017. So there are hundreds and hundreds of agencies around the country that requested Utah's DMV do a facial recognition search for them. Even if some of the agencies send data like this, it's still impossible to know precisely which agencies are sharing which photos and with whom. Now, which federal agencies have facial recognition? Unfortunately, many of them. A lot of them have their own systems as well as tapping into these state databases. FBI, Department of Homeland Security, TSA, CBP, ICE, and State Department all use facial recognition themselves. That means that when you get a passport, you get a visa, or you get TSA pre-check, the photos you submit are going into a database that can be queried for not just the purposes of identification, but for facial recognition to determine whether you match, according to an algorithm, a photo submitted by the department or by someone else. We shouldn't be forced to submit to criminal face recognition searches merely because we want to drive a car, fly on an airplane, vote, or buy alcohol, but right now we are. Now, here's a snippet of an ad from Clearview AI showing the difference between the number of photos that Clearview has, 3 billion, and the number of photos that the FBI has access to, which is now 600 million or so, and was 411 million in this ad. You might ask, is it better at least if the states have access to these photos, which we submitted supposedly voluntarily rather than private companies which scraped the information without our consent? Rather than think about which is better, we need to look closer at how face recognition works and why all law enforcement and government agency use of it should be banned. So let's just start with what is face recognition. Face recognition systems use computer algorithms to pick out distinctive details and turn those into a numerical template called a face print. And that face print is essentially like a thumbprint. It gets matched to photos that get submitted to it. You might have heard that face rec is flawed, that the tool doesn't always match the correct image with the correct person. That's true, but that's not the only problem with face recognition. Even if face recognition matched photos 100% of the time, there would still be plenty of issues and plenty of dangers when the tool is used in the hands of law enforcement. I'll get into that more, but let me introduce my colleague, Matthew Guariglia. He is an expert in police tech and police surveillance.
The fact of the matter is that in the hands of an unaccountable criminal justice system, this tech is actually very dangerous. I find there are two main ways that face surveillance does harm to whoever encounters it. First are the very physical, legal, and financial harms that come with being misidentified. In January 2020, Robert Williams was arrested by the Detroit Police Department in his driveway in Farmington Hill, Michigan. Why was he arrested? He was arrested because after scanning a blurry security camera still, the DPD's algorithm spit out Mr. Williams' name as a plausible match. In Detroit, this seems to be a regular occurrence. Less than a year earlier, Michael Oliver was arrested after an algorithm identified him as an investigative lead, and an eyewitness chose him out of a lineup, despite the fact that there was almost no other corroborating evidence. Racial biased machines, like racially biased eyes, can misidentify people. And I say racially biased machines because the training data set is itself skewed toward identifying and therefore misidentifying black and brown suspects. If the data being fed into the software has been generated by a criminal justice system that over-polices, haphazardly arrests, and charges racial minorities, then the results will also skew in that direction because that is what has been collected.
But the system itself is broken too. Right now, police don't have to submit evidence when they've used facial recognition to identify a suspect most of the time. What that means is that suspects can be identified supposedly by an algorithm that they can't interrogate, and they don't know how many other people might have been matched through the algorithm. That makes it impossible for the accused to defend themselves and to have due process. And this isn't new. As Matthew explains, the Rogues Gallery has had this effect since its creation.
I'm going to take us back over a century, because I think this point really illustrates the fundamental problems of this technology. On the night of May 10th, 1899, gambler Doc Owens was arrested on suspicion after he was accused of cheating at cards. At the police station, he was photographed, his measurements were taken and retained by the New York City Police Department. Owens was let go because there was no warrant for his arrest and no real reason to keep him, but his photograph remained with the police. As one columnist in Chattanooga, Tennessee, who covered the story wrote, quote, "Once a photograph is hung in the gallery, there is no removing it. A policy of that kind is utterly indefensible. It is a cruel injustice and a constant bar to reform. Youthful indiscretion is put on the same plane as murder. It provides no loophole through which the victim may escape the dire results of criminal publicity. Nobody is going to employ a young man or young woman whose picture adorns the Rogues Gallery." End quote. Simply put, once people were found guilty or even deemed suspicious, the retention of data would ensure that it would remain that way forever. Their face would be searched, as it is now, over and over again, and compared to every subject. Every time someone else commits a crime, the faces of hundreds or thousands or now even millions of faces are searched over and over again for guilt. It forever erodes the presumption of innocence for anyone who has gotten a driver's license or has been arrested.
So the way police tend to use face recognition, just literally the way they use the tool, is also often dangerous. You might have heard of a story where a suspect, who you can see on the left here in the image, was captured on a surveillance camera. The camera's image wasn't very clear. It was blurry, and the image didn't show up with any significant confidence, any results through the facial recognition tool. But police noticed that, in their minds at least, this potential suspect looked a little bit like Woody Harrelson. So they put a photo of Woody Harrelson through the facial recognition tool to see what would come back. This comes from a study from Georgetown University's Center on Privacy and Technology called Garbage In, Garbage Out. And it's not the only example of police submitting questionable images to facial recognition tech. They've also submitted police artist sketches and to see who they can get back, just as an example. So there are more issues with facial recognition technology than that, but that's kind of a little outline of some of the problems that we have with them. Now, you might be wondering whether EFF thinks that face recognition is inherently bad. The answer is no. This is a short demo from Apple's announcement of Face ID, which is the tool that Apple iPhones use to unlock your phone after taking a face print of your image. And then every time you turn the phone towards yourself, it determines whether that matches the face print, the image that it's seeing.
And here's how it works. Every time you glance at your iPhone 10, it detects your face with the flood illuminator, even in the dark. The IR camera takes an IR image. The dot projector projects out over 30,000 invisible IR dots. We use the IR image and the dot pattern, and we push them through neural networks to create a mathematical model of your face. And then we check that mathematical model against the one that we've stored that you set up earlier to see if it's a match and unlock your phone. And this all happens in real time. It all happens invisibly. You don't see these things going off.
So what makes face recognition good or bad? What makes it face recognition versus face surveillance? We've got a couple of simple guidelines. Can you opt out of its use? With the Apple iPhone Face ID, you don't have to use it. If it's using your image, was your image collected surreptitiously or was your image collected with your consent? Again, with the Face ID example, your image was used with your consent unless someone takes your phone and unlocks it by holding it in front of your face without your consent. Is it used to track you? Now, in most cases, it's going to be very difficult for law enforcement or government agencies to have you opt into the tool to use your image with your consent and not to track you. So it's going to do one of those things, most likely if the government is using this technology, which again is just a technology, just a tool. But if its primary function is to invade people's privacy, that's face surveillance. And that should be banned by government use and law enforcement use. But it's not always simple. In this example, you'll see an ad for a tool by MorphoTrust or IDEMIA, which is a company that sells its facial recognition technology to governments and law enforcement. So watch this and tell me if it's clear from the commercial whether you can or can't opt out. Now I'm going to go through a couple of other fun examples of face recognition technology. This is a face recognition tool by Microsoft that can supposedly recognize emotion, can perceive varieties of emotion. This is different from facial recognition in that it's not matching one image to another. It's using an algorithm to tell someone the perceived emotional state of an individual in a photo. And one of my favorite things about this example is that it very specifically says it is important to note that facial expressions alone do not represent the internal states of people. Now, I picked this image from a protest in Portland of a protester, because it's the kind of image that you might see in RoboCop to determine that someone is a threat. On the right-hand side, you'll see an example list of emotions, and the emotion that is highest according to the confidence level of the tool is anger. And that may or may not be correct, but it's just an interesting example of Microsoft's tool. Now, I'm going to pick on Microsoft a little bit more because their tool is one that's publicly available. Here is a facial recognition tool that Microsoft lets you drop 2 images into, and it will tell you its confidence level, whether or not they are the same image. And that's often how facial recognition tools work. They don't give you exact matches. They give you, let's say, 10 images or 100 images, and each of those has a confidence level that the system believes it is or is not accurate. So here I'm submitting 2 new images to this system, one of John Lewis and one of Elijah Cummings. This was a mistake that was made recently by a senator when John Lewis passed away. Now, the confidence level that these are not the same people, 19%. It's not sure. Let's try another example. This is a photo of Eminem on the left, and on the right, a photo of David Foster Wallace. The system is only 10% sure that these are not the same person. Interesting, right? But this is just a quick demo of this tool and the kind of the direction that a lot of these tools can be used to go beyond face recognition itself. And I just want to reiterate that the title here, just because you can build facial recognition tools for less than $100 doesn't mean you should. In this, the New York Times recorded video from 3 cameras and matched those videos to people that they knew worked in the area so that they could track whether or not people were in the area. And it worked. They spent less than $100 doing it. All they needed was access to the cameras. So one of the things that I'd like you to take away from this talk is that building facial recognition tools isn't that hard at this point. What's hard and what's worth doing is building tools that hack these systems or that fight back against them. Building software and creating solutions that give people more privacy, not less, is what EFF is interested in, and hopefully what you're interested in as well. Here's some fun examples if you're not an experienced coder that you might find interesting. This is from Adversarial Fashion. It's a 4th Amendment ALPR blocking hoodie that the goal of is to fill the automated license plate reader database with gibberish and confuse tools by the police, and also, of course, raise awareness of automated license plate readers. Here's another example of a face mask that says, "Do not consent. I do not consent to the search." Now I'm going to quickly go through the Who Has Your Face website so you can get a sense of what we did to make it so that you can see who has your face in a government database. If you go to the website, you'll see a quick take the quiz button. It essentially is a 5-step quiz you can use to learn which US government agencies may have access to your photo for facial recognition purposes. And there's also a longer resources page that describes in detail the photo sharing that we've discovered. So I'm just going to show you through the site what happens when you move forward. It asks you whether you have a driver's license or a state photo ID, where you live, and whether you live in a city of more than 100,000 people. I'm choosing California, and yes, because that's true. I do have a passport or US visa. I have signed up for TSA PreCheck. I have not ever applied for a US government job that required a photo, but I clicked yes there just because it'll give you some more information. And then at the end, you'll get a page like this that tells you whether your DMV shares the data with other departments and whether other departments, because you have a passport or a visa, also have access to your image for facial recognition. So what's next? How do we stop these privacy invasions? Well, we've actually been pretty successful at banning facial recognition in cities around the country. 10 US cities have voted to ban it. That includes Boston and San Francisco. But we need to ban it federally, because as long as there are loopholes where individual agencies or departments across the country can submit photos, there will be privacy invasions using facial recognition. So right now you can go to act.eff.org to tell your senator to vote yes and co-sponsor the Facial Recognition and Biometric Technology Moratorium Act of 2020. We're closer than ever to banning this tool, and I think we can do it. Hopefully you'll be able to help. So please go to act.eff.org, and please also continue thinking of other ways to make good technology and cool technology that protects privacy rather than invading it.
Welcome back. This is Who Has Your Face? The fight against U.S. government agencies' use of facial recognition. And we welcome Dr. Matthew Guariglia and Jason Kelley. Thank you so much for being here with us. So we have some questions that have come in the Matrix chat, and if you have them and would like to hear them answered, please drop them in the live stream Q&A. So a question from the audience. In China, there are already established systems to recognize faces that have masks on. Is there a push here for that now due to COVID and protests?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely there is. I mean, I think already as protests ramp up and as the first kind of studies come out that show that COVID masks kind of kill and make facial recognition incredibly inaccurate, there's absolutely going to be a push, probably within DHS, if it isn't already happening, to start to develop or maybe to purchase FR technology that is not foiled by masks.
Another question from the audience. Are there updates on the efforts of groups like Oakland Privacy?
So Oakland Privacy is a local group in the Oakland area that's focused on passing various legislation at the local level. They worked to get bans on FR and other community control of police surveillance measures passed in San Francisco and Berkeley and Oakland. They're working in Emeryville now on a measure that's similar to the measures passed in Berkeley. Matthew, do you know of any, I forget the other cities that are being pushed right now by the EFA, which is EFF's grassroots groups of the Electronic Frontier Alliance, the grassroots groups that work on things like this?
I mean, I think one huge development in California was just in Santa Cruz, in which both predictive policing and facial recognition were banned with one single ordinance.
So yeah, there's a lot going on locally. That's actually, I think, where there's a lot of movement in the country.
And in the country, another audience question. Do you think the US could achieve something like the EU's GPDR with respect to facial recognition technology?
Yes, we actually have so there's kind of two questions there. This talk is mostly about federal and government use of face surveillance. And so there is a bill that Matthew actually knows quite a bit about, more than me, that is in the federal level to ban government use of facial recognition, which would be a big start. But GDPR is mostly focused on commercial businesses, I believe. And there is a state level bill in Illinois that's passed called BIPA, the Biometric Information Privacy Act, that does ban commercial use of FR without consent and a variety of other things. And that actually has been used to sue Facebook recently, a year or two ago, for, if you log into Facebook, it would say, is this you, or does this person look like this person, or whatever. And that they use that on people in Illinois, and that was illegal under BIPA. So we do have state level bills, and we have this federal bill. Matthew, do you want to talk a little bit about that federal bill?
Sure. The federal bill introduced by people like Jayapal, Markey, Merkley, Tlaib has specifically targeted the use of face recognition in the federal government. So what it would do would put a moratorium on use of face surveillance at the federal level. So be it FBI, Customs and Border Patrol, DHS. The other thing it would do is it would interrupt some federal funding streams that help to pay for face recognition at the local and state level. So that has been introduced in the Senate and the House, and it's moving forward. EFF has an action that makes it very easy for you to contact your elected officials to ask them to pass or co-sponsor that bill. And I think also the other big thing to consider, because I would love to see a kind of push for a federal BIPA in a kind of GDPR style way, is the California privacy law, which allows you, for instance, you're able to, if you're a California resident, I was able to request to see all of the images that Clearview, which is a private company, had on me, and then request them to delete the ones that were uncovered. So there are some state provisions, like in Illinois and California, that are slowly rising up that apply to private and corporate entities, but it's not enough to wait for them to come one at a time. It states that it seems like we really have to push for this type of legislation on a federal level as well.
Okay, fantastic. We have more questions. Do FR data maintain a provenance of how the image was acquired, like date, time, GPS?
Yeah, absolutely. At least where they know that information was acquired. So for example, with Clearview, as Matt was mentioning, they scrape the data from places like Facebook, and the way they know who that person is that they pull it from that person's profile. So if they didn't have that metadata, they actually couldn't identify the person. But yeah, in general, I think that's a big part of it. It's recorded so that they know exactly as much information as they possibly can, especially given, federal databases. I'm pretty sure that's generally required, to keep that information so that they can retrieve it and delete it if necessary.
Fabulous. Okay, next question. Is the argument of facial recognition being inaccurate kind of a tenuous one? Because if it doesn't work accurately, it's dangerous. But if it does work accurately, then it's still dangerous.
Yes, I absolutely think it is tenuous. And I think that, for people committed to banning face recognition because the technology is kind of innately violent and innately violates civil liberties, that as the technology progresses, we might want to consider pivoting our arguments away from just talking about inaccuracy, because inaccuracy, as I'd argued in the talk, is very important and has dire consequences for people in terms of being misidentified. But that's not the only reason why the technology should be banned. And I think even if the technology tomorrow we woke up and it was perfect, it's still kind of a danger to civil liberties. And so, yeah, I definitely encourage people to make both arguments, but also to not rest, an entire political or legislative strategy only on the fact that it's inaccurate.
Thank you. Okay, another question. Could I put chaff on my car in the form of custom bumper stickers that just happen to be in the dimensions of license plates from other states and put them around my real one? A human would still know which is the real one, but would an ALPR be confused?
That's a very good question. I'll start by saying I don't know if that might not be legal.
Yeah, that sounds like it might be illegal, unfortunately.
Yeah. But that's a good question. I don't know. I don't know how fooled they are. I mean, there are supposedly those kind of adversarial fashion sweatshirts that have license plate on them, which theoretically can confuse ALPRs, but I don't know the effectiveness of that. So that's a good question. I don't know.
It looks like that might be the last question we have time for.
Yes.
So just thanks everyone for tuning in. Really appreciate it. And big ups for the good questions. Obviously, if you don't follow EFF, please do. Please go to EFF.org and sign up for Effector. You can also follow us on Twitter, which is @EFF. We have an Instagram, we have a Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. So please Stay tuned in those channels. And also, there's a talk coming up right after this about Clearview, so you might want to stick around for that.
Fantastic. So thank you so much to Dr. Matthew Guariglia and Jason Kelley. We appreciate you. Stick around for more Hope 2020. Back to you, ground control.